Okay, in this video, we're working on section 1.3 on how economists use theories and models to understand economic issues. So we've talked a little bit about what economics is, and we've talked about the different ways that economists approach the study of the economy with micro and macro. This section's focused on the tools that we use to analyze economic problems. Just like any science, and economics is a science, it's a social science, but there's a lot of math involved. Economists rely on a framework of theories and models that help us to make sense of what are otherwise complex realities. So our learning outcomes, by the end of this section, you should be able to interpret a circular flow diagram, explain the importance of economic theories and models, and describe the goods and services market and the labor markets. So let's start with a quote from the famous economist John Maynard Keynes. He said that economics is a technique of thinking, which helps its possessor to draw correct conclusions. Economics isn't just a subject, it's a way of understanding the world. And this is an important concept to understand. It means that economists have a specific way of looking at problems. We analyze issues using economic theories. And those theories are based on particular kinds of assumptions about human behavior. These assumptions are not necessarily the same assumptions that someone in another discipline might use, another discipline like anthropology or psychology. So the discipline of economics really does provide a unique lens to view problems in the world. Here's a picture of John Maynard Keynes, and I should mention just briefly, there is a chapter in your book, when we get into the macroeconomics, we'll focus on a little bit more, but there's a chapter on Keynesian economics, which is named after John Maynard Keynes. He's a very pivotal figure when it comes to the modern economy. And most economists today are probably Keynesian economics. Part of what he basically championed was this idea that governments can actually be quite helpful, quite useful when it comes to managing the economy in terms of dealing with depressions, dealing with recessions, things of that nature. They can be more proactive. The opposite of that being the neoclassical style of economics, which is more let the market handle the problems. Let capitalism figure these things out. Supply and demand will work its way through the system to its ultimate conclusion, and that's what's best for society. So two different kind of schools of thought. Most people today are Keynesian, but that's not to say that everybody is. But he's very influential. So what exactly are economic theories and models? Well, a theory is a simplified representation of how two or more variables interact with one another. It's a way of simplifying a complex real-world issue down to its essentials. A good theory should be simple enough to understand, but also complex enough to capture the key features of the situation. Models, on the other hand, are practical applications of these theories. We often use them for testing and for visualization. Think of it like how architects would use a scaled-down building of a model before actual construction begins. That's how we use our models in the economy. Before big, massive decisions are made that have big implications, we try to make sure the model supports it, the theory supports it. So in this course, we're going to use the terms model and theory interchangeably, but just so keep that in mind. Now, this is one of the more important economic models to understand right out the gate, which is the circular flow diagram. This is one way of visualizing the relationship between variables. Here, we actually have two different things happening. We're seeing the interaction between households and firms in both the goods and services market, which is the outer circle, and in the labor market, which is the inner circle. In the goods and services market, households receive goods and services, and they pay the firms, the companies, for those goods and services, which allows the companies to then make those products. But then the question becomes, well, how do the consumers, how do households, how do they get money to pay for the goods and services. Well, that's what happens in the labor market, the inner circle, right? In order to pay for the goods and services in the outer circle market, we have to provide our labor in the labor market. The households provide labor to the firms, and they receive payment from those firms in the form of wages, salaries, and benefits. Right? So the money that we earn from our labor in the labor market allows us to purchase the goods and services in the goods and services market. They're connected to one another, and it flows circularly because because of how the relationship works from households to firms. So that's a simplified model of two variables to their most commonly seen. But there's other ways to look at this too. There's other elements to this that we could tack on, right? We can expand this diagram any number of ways to consider more important factors, such as things like the financial markets, where savings and investments happen. In the financial market, one person who saves money, who doesn't need it, they're just saving it, they don't need it. Well, a bank or a financial intermediary, or maybe that person themselves, if they're willing, can lend that money out to someone who does need it, to a borrower. They can lend that money to a borrower. A borrower would then make regular payments back to the lender. And that's a whole cycle within itself. There's another market like the government. How does the government factor in? Well, the government takes taxes and they use that tax money to provide public spending. I'm an example of that. I'm a state employee. Part of my paycheck comes from state income tax, as well as other things like tuition and federal aid and things like that. But part of my money comes from taxes, and so everybody supports the tax system with what taxes they pay in: property taxes, sales taxes, income taxes, all these different taxes, and then that goes into the government, who then determines how to spend that money on public goods like education, K through 12, higher ed, roads, bridges, et cetera, right? And then another element would be like global trade, which is involving imports and exports, which we'll cover more on later. So all these different additions to the circular flow diagram, all we're really trying to do with it is show the relationships between all the different variables. It's not intended to describe every aspect of the real world, but it helps us to capture what are the essential economic interactions that are taking place. So finally, let's just consider, a little bit more about this idea of the theories and models and how it actually works. We have tools, and our tools are mostly visual tools in the economy. By visual, I mean it's a lot of, you really have to visualize a lot of this stuff, just like with that diagram I just showed you. So we express the theories, we express those in visual form through things like diagrams, like what I just showed you, and also things like supply and demand curves. We express them through graphs. We express them sometimes through equations. We try not to express them through equations in this class because that's a little bit, it gets people confused, and we're just early days here. But graphs and models, I mean, they're not supposed to be illustrations of conclusions. They're supposed to be illustrations that help you understand a little bit more about the variables at play. So economists, we use these things really just to understand the way the world works. All right. I think if you sit and think about this diagram for a little bit, it's a very simple diagram, but it explains how the world works. It explains that when you get a job, you get paid for that job, for that labor, and you take the money that you earn and you buy goods and services. And that's good for everybody. Everybody wins. You win, the business wins, everybody wins. As long as we're all willing to make trade with one another, to exchange resources with one another. And you can build on it and build on it and build on it, like I said, with the other types of markets. So these tools, these visual tools, graphs, diagrams, equations, they allow us to analyze problems and to come up with policy solutions. So that's going to conclude our discussion on how we use theories and models. We're obviously going to focus a lot more on this throughout the class because it comes up often. But in the next section, we're going to focus a little bit more on how economies are organized. We're going to look at market economies, traditional economies, command economies, and what ultimately most countries use, which are mixed economies. So I will see you in that one.